Before we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to thank my viewers. The pilot episode for this series, where I talked about Super Mario Bros., is currently the second most viewed video on the channel. It might not be much right now, but it tells me that I should definitely continue this series. Who knows, maybe one day I'll actually be able to monetize these videos. For now though, I'm happy with the amount of progress I'm making. So, let's start the video. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of From Pixels to Pictures. Today we're going to take a look at our next film adaptation of a video game, the 1994 film Double Dragon, based on the 1987 arcade game of the same name. In our previous video, we looked at the film Super Mario Bros., the first video game adaptation. And to be honest, I'm surprised that the film wasn't the only video game adaptation. The film was such a colossal failure with terrible reviews and an embarrassing box office performance. It's a wonder that Hollywood didn't go, well, let's never do that again. The only reason I can think of is that when Super Mario Bros. Was in production, other film studios were under the impression that the film would be a huge hit, and they thought that video game movies would be the next big thing. So they quickly greenlit a bunch of them. In the case of Double Dragon, you can definitely tell that this film took a lot of inspiration from Super Mario Bros., even right down to the film's tagline. To be honest, this movie might take more inspiration from the Super Mario Bros. Movie than it does from the actual source material it's supposed to be adapting, but more on that later. The game Double Dragon was an arcade game that was later turned into an NES game. I was unable to play the arcade version for research, so I instead played the NES version. And yes, I am aware that there are differences between the two versions, but most of my comparisons in this review will be focused on the NES game. While Double Dragon, the game, might not be as revolutionary or as good as Super Mario Bros., the game, it still manages to be a fun, challenging, and addictive experience. The film adaptation came out in 1994, directed by James Yukich, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and starring Robert Patrick, Mark Dacascos, Scott Wolf, Julie Nixon, and Alyssa Milano. Believe it or not, this film was an even bigger failure than Super Mario Bros., coming in 12th place on its opening weekend. 12th place. For reference, that same time, Forrest Gump was on its 18th weekend, and it made it to 9th place. So, when it's your opening weekend and you're making less money than a movie that's already been in theaters for 17 weeks, you know you're doing something wrong. And in case you're wondering how it did with critics, on Rotten Tomatoes this movie currently stands at a whopping 8%. Jeez. So, is this movie bad? Yes it is. But what we're here to analyze today is it a bad adaptation? Well, let's find out. We'll be starting with round 1, characters. So keep in mind, we are still in the early years of video games. You're not going to find any Shakespearean-level characters in these games for a while, and this is definitely true with Double Dragon. None of the characters in this game have depth, humanity, or even personality, so naturally the film tries to add these elements to the characters. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work. Like Super Mario Bros., this film focuses on two brothers, Billy and Jimmy Lee. Now, you can't really infer a lot of information about these brothers from just playing the game, but here's what the NES instruction manual has to say. Double Dragon is the story of Billy and Jimmy Lee, twin brothers who learned to fight on the cold, tough streets of the city. Their expert knowledge of the martial arts, combined with their street smarts, has made them both formidable fighting machines. Now, call me crazy, but when I played this game and read that description, I thought, okay, this has cinematic potential. Unlike Super Mario Bros., which I really have no idea how you would go about making a live-action adaptation of that game, this story feels somewhat grounded in the real world. I feel like you could have gone in-depth with these two characters, how they cope with their past, as well as their outlook on the world. You could have gotten something like The Karate Kid, with a gritty setting of the underbelly of a city dealing with family dilemmas while still maintaining the martial arts action of the games. This could work as a movie. So, what went wrong? In the movie, the brothers are played by Mark Dacascos and Scott Wolf. While Dacascos does have an Asian background, Wolf is clearly American and clearly white. There's also a 4-year age gap between the two actors, so I guess you can forget about the whole twins thing. It's interesting because while some of the marketing makes the contrast in the brothers' skin tone incredibly obvious, it's not so obvious in the actual movie. to the point where I have to wonder if Scott Wolf is deliberately tanned in an attempt to match DeCasco's skin tone. Now, outside of the obvious poor casting, I never bought the relationship between the two brothers. I get the sense that the actors were trying, but it ultimately doesn't work. And I think the main reason why is that even though they're trying to establish how well the two brothers work as a team, we don't get a feel for their individual personalities. Say what you will about Super Mario Bros., but in that movie, Mario and Luigi had distinct personality traits. They didn't really match up with the game's interpretation, but they worked as their own characters. Mario is a cynical grump. Luigi is a youthful dreamer. These are two personality traits that clash with each other, creating conflict and some form of character growth. But here, I know that Billy wears blue and Jimmy wears red, and watching that movie, that was pretty much the only way I could tell them apart. Neither one of them really went through an arc either. And yes, I know they really didn't have much to go off of in the game, but come on, you could have done so much more with these characters. And the race thing certainly didn't help. But it's not just the two brothers. The film has a mix of American actors and Asian actors. A better director could have found a way to portray both cultures respectfully, but the way it's done here just comes across as confused, as if the film itself is having an identity crisis. Take the villain, for example. Robert Patrick was probably the biggest name attached to this movie, as evidenced by the fact that he received top billing. Now, if they had gone in the direction of casting two Asian leads, then I'd say the casting of Robert Patrick is a smart move. He can be the big draw of the movie for people who aren't familiar with the game. But the problem lies in the character's name. Robert Patrick's character is named Koga Shuko. Yes, you heard that right, Koga Shuko. And he wants the Double Dragon Medallion because of his connections to his ancestors. So, apparently the filmmakers expect you to believe that this character is Asian when he is so obviously white. As a villain, while he does provide a legitimate threat throughout the story, his motivations are weak. There's no real sense of why he wants what he wants other than an uncontrollable lust for more power. It's exactly like Koopa in Super Mario Bros. In fact, this whole performance just feels like a poor man's Dennis Hopper. He's not as enjoyable as Hopper was throughout that film. He just tries to be cool and in control, but he comes across as forgettable. And then we have Marion, played by Alyssa Milano. In the game, Marion is the name of Billy's girlfriend, who gets punched in the stomach and then taken away, and the Lee brothers have to rescue her. Her only role in the game was to be the damsel in distress. With Milano's performance, there seems to be a clear attempt to subvert this, having her character be an action heroine who works alongside the brothers throughout a good chunk of the story. Now, as I'll discuss in later rounds, I think that changing her role in the story might not have been the best idea for the overall narrative. But with that being said, the character presented is not a bad one. She's presented as being the leader of the resistance, not only doing everything she can to stop the oppressive government, but also finding a home for orphaned children who have nowhere to go, and all while keeping her true job a secret from her father, who is a police officer. Honestly, if they focused on this character more, it might have been a better movie. Okay, it wouldn't have been faithful to the games, but I think that ship sailed a long time ago. As for the other characters that cross over, well, that's mainly the villain's henchmen. I do like how they actually explain how the villain is able to convince all of these thugs to go after the Lee brothers. Beyond that, though, only two of the enemies from the game actually make appearances in the film. There's Linda, played by Christina Wagner. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the original game is one of the first games to include female characters as enemies. It can be a tricky balance, actively encouraging the player to beat up women, and it's especially odd in this game, where the entire plot is set in motion because of a woman getting beaten up. Yeah, the morals do get confusing, but back on topic. The Linda of the movie doesn't really resemble her counterpart in the game, but the character works fine for what she has to do. And then there's Abobo, and this is where the movie really dropped the ball. It would have been fine if they just portrayed Abobo as a big muscular guy who works for the villain, but instead they decided to make him a normal thug who gets turned into an inhuman monster. Abobo ends up getting his own arc in the film, complete with what I guess is supposed to be an emotional moment, but doesn't work at all. Abobo's entire arc seems to be inspired by Toad's transformation into a Goomba in the Super Mario Bros. Movie. It's crazy that the filmmakers felt the need to steal so much stuff from that movie, especially seeing how, as sad as this sounds, Abobo is one of the few characters in this movie that has an arc. And that's about it for characters who actually cross over. As for characters exclusive to the movie, we have Satori, played by Julia Nixon, and my main problem with this character is that the movie never really explains what her relationship is to the Lee brothers. At first I thought she was a friend/girlfriend of one of the brothers, Then we see her explaining the family legend of the Double Dragon Medallion, which made me think she was their mother. Their incredibly young-looking mother. And then after I heard the brothers call her by her first name, that really confused me. It made me think, maybe sister? Finally, I had to look it up on Wikipedia and confirm that she is in fact their adoptive mother. Okay, a little bit more exposition would have been helpful, movie. Especially considering how there's not a very big age gap between Julie Nixon and the two actors playing her adopted sons. Besides, when the audience has to look up critical plot points on Wikipedia, you fail as a movie. The last character I'm going to talk about might be one of my favorite characters in the film, Marion's father. While his screen time is limited, we do get a sense of both his strained relationship with his daughter as well as his conflicting view on the law. Again, if the movie focused on this character more, we might have gotten a better movie. As a whole, the movie might actually have too many characters to juggle. A lot of the characters just go through a series of beats, but I can't really fault the actors for this. But I did like some of the directions they went with, and let's face it, they had absolutely nothing to go off of. But at the same time, they could have done so much more with these characters. I'm going to give it a 3 on the scale. Our next round is setting, and man, did they really screw this up. In my last review, I talked about how the setting from the Mario games could not have been easy to translate into a live-action film. The same cannot be said of Double Dragon. The first 2 stages of the game, at least in the NES version, are set in an area that seems very close to our world, the back alley of a city, which eventually leads into an industrial area. This feels familiar, like something we would see in our everyday lives. The remaining 2 stages are a little bit more far-fetched, a forest leading to a cave, which ultimately leads to a secret underground temple. It's a little out there to be sure, but most audiences would probably be able to suspend their disbelief a little if the direction and atmosphere are good enough. Alternatively, you could have chosen to tone down those elements from the second half and focus more on the urban, realistic setting. Or you could have gone the opposite approach and set the whole thing in Asia from the start. Yes, there are a number of approaches that could have worked just fine in adapting this source material, so naturally they decided to set this movie in the future. Of course. I mean, if you can't see the obvious connection between the subject matter of this game and the post-apocalyptic setting of the movie, that means you're sober. Congratulations. There is no reason to set this story in the future. You could set the story in modern times and nothing is lost at all. Oh, except for that whole plot point about how the police don't work after dark, but was that really necessary in making the adaptation work? I guess you could argue that it explains how all these bad guys are able to get away with beating up our heroes, but they could have just set the story in the slums of a city where the cops aren't very effective at their jobs. It would have worked just fine. And on top of that, this movie has some of the worst world building I have ever seen in my life. They don't do a good enough job of establishing how this future works. Instead, they're too busy cramming in future jokes on various news broadcasts, like Madonna announced today that her relationship with Tom Arnold is finished, or, and now over to our weatherman, Andy Dick. And the bad world building is doubly insulting because it was completely unnecessary. Just set it in modern day. Boom, no world building required. And now you have extra time to focus on character development. There's so much stuff going on in this movie already, we don't need to add world building to the mix too. And just to top it all off, most stories about a post-apocalyptic future are set far off in the future. Doesn't matter how you choose to portray the future because the audience probably won't live to see it. Well, this movie came out in 1994, but is set in the far-off, post-apocalyptic world of 2007. Seriously, even back then people were like, yeah, I'm pretty sure the world can't change that much in just 13 years. So, just like Super Mario Bros., this movie completely misses the point of the game's setting. But at least with that movie, you could maybe make the argument that the filmmakers didn't know how to go about recreating the setting from the game, but for this movie, that wouldn't have been a problem. I genuinely don't know what they were thinking. It gets a 1. And now, the story. Even though the story in this game is fairly simple, there actually is a story to be told. At the beginning of the game, whether you're playing the arcade version or the NES version, the first thing you see is a group of thugs approaching a woman. One of them goes up to her and proceeds to punch her in the stomach, grab her, and throw her over his shoulder, and then the thugs walk away. It's simple, but it's surprisingly effective. Yeah, it's kind of standard in games to have the protagonist rescue a woman, and it does sort of undermine female characters, but it's rare that you actually see the woman getting kidnapped. For 1987, opening up an arcade game by showing an act of violence, in particular an act of violence towards a woman, it's genuinely shocking. And as a gamer, what's your objective? Your objective is to find the guys who did this, kick their butts, and save her. And after seeing that, you're pumped up. You want to kick their butts. You want to make these people pay for what they did, and you want to ensure that this woman won't suffer anymore. This opening, simple as it may be, is a genuinely powerful moment that never happens in the movie. The character of Marion still retains her name, but she is not a damsel in distress. There's only one scene where she's actually in trouble and Billy needs to save her, but even then, that scene happens near the end of the movie and only lasts about a minute. And usually I am all for taking weak female characters and making them stronger, but this is one instance where I feel like they made the wrong decision. In the words of the animated heroine, I'm okay with a woman needing to be rescued if it's realistic. If they wanted to make Marion a stronger character, I think there were other ways around it. You could have done something where she still gets kidnapped at the beginning, but then she escapes halfway through and then tries to get to the Lee brothers or tries to take down the villain by herself. It is possible to have a female character be in peril, but still have her be a strong and interesting character. I mean, heck, look at Daisy in the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Yes, she needs to be rescued, that's a large part of the plot, but she still feels smart and interesting, like her own character. Oh man, I can't believe I'm actually complimenting the Super Mario Bros. Movie. And don't get me wrong, the Marion character portrayed here is a strong character in her own right, but the decision to change her character came at the expense of the larger story. Now, to be fair, in the movie, there is still a reason for the bad guy to go after the Lee brothers. They have the other half of the Double Dragon medallion, after all. A medallion that I'm pretty sure didn't exist in the game. Much like Super Mario Bros. Wow, how many times have I said that today? Well, anyway, the script feels like it started off as a story completely unrelated to the source material, and the overabundance of subplots does get pretty intense at times. But, with all that being said, there is one thing that I want to call out. One decision that the filmmakers made that I genuinely think was clever. Over the course of the movie, the villain shows his ability to morph into other people. At first, this comes across as a lazy way to remind the audience of Robert Patrick's performance as the T-1000. Right up until the end. There was a scene near the end of the film where the villain possesses Jimmy Lee. I wasn't initially sure where the scene was going, but once Billy ends up having to fight the villain in Jimmy's body, I went, oh, like in the NES version. Now, a little history. In the arcade version of the game, two players fight alongside each other against the mysterious Shadow Boss. But because the NES version couldn't handle two players fighting simultaneously, they decided to have Billy be the only playable character. Okay, cool, but where's Jimmy? Well, the NES version throws in a twist that reveals that Jimmy is the Shadow Boss, and now Billy is forced to fight his own brother. It's a twist that comes out of nowhere, and most people don't consider it to be canon. I was aware that the movie was going to stick closer to the arcade version in that regard, and it made sense. But still, the NES version of the game is the one a lot of kids at the time were familiar with, so having this battle between the two brothers was a nice nod to fans of the NES game, while still fitting with the movie's established logic. So, when looking at the story overall, I'm torn. Even though a lot of the subplots are very rushed and unnecessary, the filmmakers do show a clear understanding of Chekhov's gun. There are a lot of surprises near the end of the film that could have come across as a Deus Ex Machina, but were set up well before. Some of these subplots feel like they could have worked if more time had been devoted to them. Other subplots feel like they should have been dropped completely. With a few rewrites, this script is salvageable. There's a good movie in here trying to get out, but unfortunately it doesn't quite make it. I give it a 4. And now we arrive at the final round experience, and believe it or not, I might actually be a little kinder to the movie here than I have been in previous rounds. So, as I said in my first review, what makes video games stand out from other forms of storytelling is that they are an interactive experience. And the challenge that a lot of video game adaptations face is how to still make the story compelling even when it's no longer interactive. Now, while the movie does have some serious problems, one place where I genuinely think the movie succeeds is the action sequences. One final time, let's look back at Super Mario Bros. What was the primary gameplay mechanic in that game? Jumping. And how much jumping was there in the movie? Barely any. Now, what was the primary gameplay mechanic in Double Dragon? Kung Fu fighting. And is there Kung Fu fighting in this movie? Yes. Yes, there is. Quite a lot of it, actually. And it seems like a simple thing, but it's something that so many adaptations get wrong. And the Kung Fu scenes in this movie are quite good. Okay, it's no Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but they're pretty solid in my opinion. I liked the fact that the first time we see the Lee brothers, they're practicing martial arts. True, there were probably better ways to do it. The game seems to imply that the boys' upbringing was a lot harsher and more realistic, but what we got here isn't bad. Now, in the Nostalgia Critic review, he complained about the boat chase scene, saying it wasn't like the game, but really, it makes sense that not every action scene would be martial arts based, otherwise it would start to feel repetitive. And we still get martial arts based sequences for the majority of the action, so it's a fair balance. And while the car chase at the beginning comes across as weird due to the surreal nature of the setting, the boat chase is one of the highlights of the movie. I especially love the use of practical effects in this movie. This was during a time when Hollywood was still figuring out how to use CGI properly. So when you see a giant explosion in this movie, you know it's a real explosion. And even if a bunch of wires and stunt doubles were used, it's still real people doing martial arts. As someone unfamiliar with martial arts, it didn't look too fake to me. The film also established the importance of teamwork. Billy, Jimmy, and Marion all had to work together to win the day. Anybody who's played the original arcade game with 2 players knows that feeling. You can't win the day all by yourself. You need help. You need support. And while the importance of teamwork could have been explored more, I'm glad we at least got a hint of that theme. Now, with all that being said, the experience of watching this movie is far from perfect. The characters, story, and setting all drag this movie down tremendously. But at the same time, I feel that this movie is salvageable. There's a good movie here trying to get out, and it's hard to tell who's at fault here, the writers, the director, the actors, but the final film just doesn't come together. At times, it feels like it almost works as just a dumb action movie to pass the time. It is mercifully short and doesn't overstay its welcome. But at the same time, it's almost too short. By the time the film is over, you feel like you've barely learned anything about this world or these people. So, when it all comes down to it, the film as a whole doesn't work. But when it comes to the experience, I feel at least that they were trying. I give it a 6. So, when I put it all together, the 1994 film Double Dragon gets 14 out of 40, which translates to 35%. That's definitely an improvement over Super Mario Bros., but it still gets an F. It's funny because I think Super Mario Bros. Might be the better movie, or at least the movie I would rather watch, given how entertaining it can be. But Double Dragon is, in my opinion, the more faithful adaptation. But we've still got a long way to go before any of these video game adaptations can be called good. Heck, even a D score would be an achievement. I wonder what will be the first video game adaptation to get that score, if it ever happens. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and join me next time when I take a look at the film adaptation of Street Fighter. See you then.